It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Steve Baker, Labour MP Siobhan McDonagh, Unison General Secretary Christina McAnee and Chief Executive of the website Conservative Home, Mark Wallace. Today, is this a good use of money?
A Royal Yacht is a great idea and I'm very positive about it because I think it will more than pay for itself many, many times over.
This is a big promise.
We are pledged here in the UK to deliver net zero by 2050. We have a responsibility to our planet to lead in this way and to do this.
Steve Baker says it's a ruinous economic experiment. Is he right? Labour calls for the Windrush compensation scheme to be taken away from ministers. And COVID causes chaos in England and Scotland's Euros campaign.
We're abiding by all of the regulations, and at the moment that's why the two boys are having to isolate until we have more information and confirmation of where we stand.
Well, let's start with that story from Gareth Southgate responding to the news that England footballers, you can see in these pictures either side there, Mason Mount and Ben Chilwell are self-isolating after coming into contact with Scotland's Billy Gilmour, who has tested positive for COVID-19. Now, Billy Gilmour is the only player in the Scotland squad who is self-isolating, and then the two England players that I have just mentioned. My opening question, certainly to Steve and Siobhan, is people might not understand why the rules are being applied in the way they are for the Euros. Is it one rule for ordinary people and a different rule for footballers at the Championships?
Well, it does look like it is, yes, but it's not the first time this has happened in the course of the crisis. We've had all sorts of contradictions and differences. So, for example, people could leave home to render a charitable service, for example, so that was an exemption. So it wouldn't be the first time. But what I would say is I imagine, though I don't know, that what's happening is that they're taking advantage of the pilot where people can have daily testing, the thing that Michael Gove is, of course, doing instead of quarantining after travelling. So presumably that's another example where a pilot is coming in and the rules will change for all.
Siobhan, what do you think? Do you think people will say the COVID rules would be applied differently in my life?
The rules are being applied differently, but then they have for football throughout the crisis. It's like the kind of safety valve. I mean, we're all enjoying the Euros. Nobody wants to stop, and it would be a brave person to stop Scotland playing tonight. So it is a real challenge. I think the problem with the testing, as we discussed outside the meeting, was actually outside this programme. I think it's 5 days before the virus will actually show up. So the daily testing up to today is really not going to work.
So big blow, Christina, for Scotland that Billy Gilmour isn't playing. Would you have liked to have seen the players vaccinated before they went to the Championships? That was the suggestion from Gareth Southgate, but in the end it didn't happen. They weren't given that priority.
Well, there was a lot of special pleading throughout the pandemic, particularly when we went into lockdown last year, for specific groups. I mean, we ourselves in Unison were calling for people like classroom assistants and teaching assistants to be vaccinated, and other groups were obviously putting in a plea. I mean, my view is that they have to follow the science on this. Now, I imagine these young footballers are hugely valuable to their managers and to the people who run them, and I'm sure they'll be taking every precaution they can to keep them safe. And I suppose when you talk about rules applying differently, for me, one of the things that's obvious from this is that when these young players are self-isolating, I'm assuming they're still being paid. And I think compare and contrast that with many low-paid workers who've had to self-isolate, like care workers who either go into statutory sick pay or indeed nothing. So rules are very different for different groups across COVID.
Right. Should those exceptions be made, though, Mark, for big sporting events like the Euros, like Wimbledon, Ascot?
Well, in terms of the rules or in terms of early vaccination?
Well, either.
Well, I think on the early vaccination thing, exactly as we've just heard, there was a lot of different special pleading. Frankly, I think it's the right thing to do morally, and it seems medically, that we as a country put everyone in the order that was meant to be their level of risk. The fact is that I think it's a good thing that in our country, whether you're a multimillionaire footballer, whether you're the heir to the throne, whether you're even the government ministers overseeing the vaccination programme, everybody took their place in the queue and got their jab when they were due without special treatment. And that's one thing that saved thousands of lives. Unfortunately, there are some administrations around the world where they gave in to special pleading from one interest group or another and upended the order regardless of medical risk, and it hasn't helped people.
All right, I'm going to show everybody this headline in the Evening Standard. It says, new £200 million royal yacht, silly populist nonsense, says Ken Clarke. He also went on to say in an interview today that there are people at Number 10 who think there is such a thing as free money. You heard, though, in the headlines, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, saying it'll pay for itself over and over again in terms of soft power and encouraging investment to UK PLC. Steve, do you agree with Ken Clarke or Matt Hancock?
Well, I do think it will be a good thing. I think the yacht will, as in the past, allow us to project our culture, our values around the world, and I do think it's a good thing. Something we ought to ask, although £200 million is, of course, a lot of money, it's about consistent with buying a good quality ship. Is it really an enormous amount of money for the good that it can do? Well, actually, I have to say I think it probably is something we should invest in, which will pay for itself.
Siobhan?
The royal family don't want it, at least they're reported as not wanting it. CBI came out today saying that it was not a good use of money. I mean, personally, if I had my choice over 200 million, there's quite a few homeless families in my constituency I'd like to see have homes built.
Right. Mark?
I'm not surprised that Ken Clarke, who, let's remember, didn't want the UK to have an independent trade policy in the first place when it came to EU membership. I'm not surprised he's not keen, but used in the right way, they've got to make sure they're used the right way. How much money do we spend on trade pavilions and trade shows exhibiting our potential exports around the world? View this as the same kind of thing. As long as it's used in the right way, you could make money from it.
Christina?
No, it's a populist idea coming from a populist prime minister. I just think, seriously, is this really sending out the right message about where the government should be spending its money? What are the real priorities at the moment? We've been waiting for, there was meant to be a summit on care today, for example, and the prime minister cancelled it. There's far more important things in the country that need to be dealt with, and even if but what Steve is saying and others are saying that this could pay for itself. You can say that about so many other things. I just think it sends out entirely the wrong message at this particular time to be investing in the royal yacht. And I'm not surprised if I haven't heard this, but if Siobhan says that even the royal family don't want it, I have to say I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Queen's pretty horrified by the idea of it as well.
Well, Mark, you were shaking your head.
Well, listen, I just wonder how many trade union members in this country make their living from their companies that they work for, managing to make exports. I mean, that is something that self-evidently is a positive activity for this country. And I don't think it's just an either or of, well, do we do trade or do we have other government policies? By definition, you've got to try to do both in a £700 billion first world state.
That's assuming that the trade comes from a ship that currently doesn't exist. I think you do trade by producing good items at prices that people want to pay. I don't think you do it on the basis of a ship.
But you also do it, for example, the fact is the UK does employ people around the world whose job it is, alongside our embassies, to do trade missions, to help to introduce producers and service providers in this country to markets abroad. Those things, I'm assuming you'd agree, are part of successfully exporting.
Siobhan?
Absolutely. But the question is a £200 million ship at the time when we have government borrowing at previously unforecastable levels, at the time when we have furlough coming to an end, where we have people homeless, we have, as Christina said, the issues of social care being meetings being cancelled rather than going ahead. It's about priorities. And for me, this wouldn't be the priority.
Steve?
I wouldn't want to drag the royal family into this discussion. This is about a ship. Ships and aeroplanes, excuse me, and helicopters are all very, very expensive. If the government thinks it's a good investment, then they've simply got to make the most of it.
All right, you have a little bit of water. Christina?
even if the evidence is there, and to prove that this actually aids trade, and I completely agree that we need to export, we need to have trade deals in the country for the country. Of course, you do. Even if the evidence was there, I would still question whether this is the right time for it. I think it sends out, I think, the wrong message at a time when people are really worried about what's going to happen in the future. There's lots of concern out there about what will happen post-COVID. And just to say, well, let's spend 200 million out of the MOD budget on the Royal Yacht, I think just... People, I know most of our members, I think, would be pretty horrified by it.
Right, well, in terms of spending... Oh, sorry, go on, Steve.
The ship can be used for other purposes. So you can well imagine this also being a fallback hospital ship. So, I can see that the MOD, if the ship is well designed, the MOD could put it to good uses in contingency were it not being used for trade purposes. So I don't think we should be too narrow, and we shouldn't lose sight of just how much money is spent on equipment right across the board. All
right, well, let's not be narrow. Let's broaden it out to the other point that Ken Clarke was making. He's no longer a Conservative MP, Mark, but he may find some sympathy with people in the Conservative Party who worry that perhaps their party and the government is letting spending get out of control.
Well, this is somewhere where I think Siobhan and I, for example, do have some common ground, which is, if you leave aside the principle of the activity, the question of being careful about the cost, of course, that's important. That applies whether it's on this particular project or whether it's on other things. And to a certain extent, we're seeing, a once-in-a-century event that we're coming out of, but a once-a-month conflict in British government back to time immemorial, which is Downing Street number 10 Downing Street wants to spend money, and number 11 Downing Street wants to look at the balance sheet and look ahead. And, there are important questions for Conservatives in terms of how, once you open the taps in a crisis, how do you manage to rein that control back in? Remember, there were a lot of World War II analogies flying around last year about public spending. The big expansions of the state and the exchequer in World War II took until the 1990s in some cases, in a few cases even beyond that, to undo. So you have to be very careful not to get not to get completely addicted just to splashing the cash.
Right, is the party addicted to it, Steve, in terms of splashing the cash? And actually, if it does have to be paid for, we've had a discussion already yesterday about a potential raid on pensions or ending the manifesto commitment to the triple lock. Would you be in favour of that?
Well, to take a couple of those questions, first of all, where's the money coming from? So we're borrowing this money, but we're borrowing it from the Bank of England, creating it through QE. Now, I'm afraid inflation is going to burst that bubble, and that's going to cause a really serious problem when the amount of money we're spending is so very high. I think that actually the government might find it's changing the mandate of the Bank of England, and that would be very serious. On the triple lock, if you look at the situation we're in at the moment, there's a real problem that because low-paid people have lost their jobs through coronavirus, we could now end up seeing earnings apparently soaring. Rise. And then pensions going up to follow earnings. And I think that would be a real injustice when it's lower-paid people who've lost out. So I do think, I'm afraid, that the triple lock should be modified and possibly reduced to a double lock to remove the 2.5%. I think that in the circumstances we face, we've got to be really serious about where the big bucks go, and I'm afraid the pensions triple lock, particularly in the context of the earnings figures, should really be on the table for discussion.
Right, and the triple lock obviously being pensions rising in line with either wages, 2.5%, or inflation, whichever is the highest. Christina?
I would hate to see the triple lock disappear, and I think it's good to see people are concerned about the low paid, but I think low paid workers are the ones who are most likely to be dependent on their pension in older age, and to see that being devalued or run down would just increase pensioner poverty. Well, I think in terms of whether the government's spending too much, I think what they have to do is think about what we're spending, why we're spending it. So I'm all in favour of, being careful about the country's money and where we spend it. But you have to look at what it is that got us through the pandemic this time round, and it was having. We absolutely need well-resourced, sustainable public services to get us through any kind of crisis, and if we don't invest in them going forward, if we don't invest in the workers who provide those services, we'll start to see higher turnover, which again costs money because you have to continually recruit and train staff. We have to be looking at all of these things, because this will not be the last crisis that the country faces. There will either be a new variant of this, there will be different viruses possibly, we'll have climate change, the issues that come from that. There are bound to be things coming towards us over the next few years that we can't foresee at the moment. And the way to do that is to have a resilient public sector as well as a strong economy. I'm not denying, obviously that's important too, but it's how you actually have resilient public services that get you through that. And I recognise that has to be done through public money. One of the things I would like to see is a fundamental shift around taxation in this country. We tax earnings, but we don't tax wealth. And we've seen the increasing rise in numbers of billionaires since COVID has happened. That seems to be something that happens every year, but it seemed to be particularly beneficial to some people this year.
All right, well, let's talk about that issue of taxing wealth more rather than earnings. Steve, would you be in favour of that?
No, because there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our economy works. I think people have begun to face up to the reality that if you engage in hundreds of billions of QE to keep the bond markets quantitative easing, money creation, that puts new money into the hands of people who own assets and inflates the price of those assets. So it's no wonder in this monetary environment that the people who hold financial assets have become richer. That foments then a sense of injustice about social processes in the economy and leads to just the kind of comments we've heard. I think we face a crisis of the kind people have barely begun to face up to because of the scale of QE, the coming of inflation and the dependency of the state upon that bond market. I'm afraid it is a bit complicated, but it's going to become very simple shortly. The government's, I think, going to face a crisis of the public finances and the bond market, and then it will become very tricky to know what to do.
Siobhan?
I think we have a huge generational time bomb financially in this country. We have some pensioners who are becoming increasingly well, increasingly asset rich, while we have younger people unable to get onto the property ladder because of increasing property prices, who are not earning the money, who don't have the pensions that those of us who are older are fortunate to have. And at some point, we've got to have a reckoning about that generational issue, which is why I think we need to have a look at the triple lock. I know that's hard politically. I know that's going to be difficult. And we have to protect poorer pensioners, but we have to say what is right and fair. We can't always rely on those young working people paying ever more tax with ever less benefit, with ever less security for their futures. And we've got to be brave enough to look at it.
Steve?
It does require political bravery. Of course it does. I'm very conscious my voters will be listening to what I say on this stuff. But the reality is we're talking about the rate of increase of pensions. There's no question of undermining the current figures. But, can we afford to keep on that, raising the pensions by that triple lock in this environment?
OK, well, Christina, you've heard the two MPs here. What do you think?
Well, if you look around other European countries, now I realise this may not be a selling point to some of the people on the call, but when you look around some of the other European countries, we don't have a particularly generous pension system in this country. We have some of the poorest pension provision instead of state pension that you see that we've seen across Europe. So it's not that we are being overly generous. We have high levels of pensioner poverty, particularly among low-income pensioners. That's a massive issue. The average pension that a public sector worker leaves with is something like £7,000 a year. This idea that they're all gold-plated pensions just isn't the reality for most people.
But nobody suggested, forgive me, but nobody suggested they're gold-plated. But
I know you haven't said it here, but it has been said in the past. And I'm just commenting on that fact that actually for public sector workers, many of them look in bemusement when they see some of these headlines. But that's why the state pension becomes so important going forward. And I think we do have to look fundamentally at where we're raising money from in this country. We have a whole load of new, very wealthy people who've sprung up since the pandemic has has happened.
Okay.
So it hasn't been a disaster for everyone. It has been something that's meant certain people, certain organisations have made a lot of money from it.
All right.
And that's something that has to be looked at.
Okay,
and we
brief-
have to start taxing people according to what their wealth is, not just what their earnings are.
Briefly, Siobhan.
I agree with Christina on the wealth tax because you can't go to work to make yourself really rich anymore. You make yourself rich by acquiring assets. If you look at the stamp duty holiday, the people benefiting from that were not the young first-time buyers attempting to get their first place, their first home. It was people buying their second and their third home. And the problem with that is we are asking people who are earning ever less in real terms to pay more towards that without the security of owning their own home. And that is not a deal that younger generations are going to carry on accepting.
Final word from you, Mark, having listened to what everybody said, not just on the triple lock, but generally about a reckoning on spending and borrowing.
Yeah, it concerns me that we have this kind of, I think, contradictory attitude to tax. You know, when we want to stop people smoking or drinking, we put tax to deter it. We're about to have a conversation, I suspect, about when we want to stop people polluting and putting out carbon, we add tax to deter it. And then we say, oh, well, work and success, let's put a tax on that. And what's the outcome? Well, you deter it.
All right, we are going to move on to exactly that subject. Mark, let's just show you this headline in the Sun newspaper. Steve Baker, our guest here, it's from last month. The headline, the net zero boiler ban will leave Britain's poorest out in the cold. This is part of what you've been writing about in terms of the costs of going green, Steve, and the government's net zero target. That's reducing the UK's carbon emissions to zero by 2050. Now, in this particular piece, you talk about the cost of replacing gas boilers with more costly green alternatives, and you say ministers plan to end the comfortable lifestyles we have enjoyed for generations. Now, Steve, as you know, ministers would argue very powerfully that their plan is to prevent catastrophic global warming.
Yeah, that's clear, but this is an evasion, if I may say so. So I'm not talking about the science, I'm not talking about the goals. The goals are in law, the science is settled, this is talking about it, arguing about his OTOs. I'm afraid I'm being a details man here and an engineer and asking the question about how. How are we going to do it? Who's going to pay? Where are the costs going to fall? Is it going to work? So I think the line I'm taking is one which anyone could agree with, that what we're doing, getting to net zero, must be politically and economically viable using existing technologies. Because if it's not, then it will fail. So even if people want to get to net zero faster, harder, they should be looking at methods which are going to work. So I think saying to people, £10,000 for a heat pump, by the way, you'll need to raise your floor levels so you can get the underfloor heating in or have bigger radiators. That will be extra cost. Pricing you out of owning a car. These things are not going to turn out to be politically viable.
Right, politically viable we'll discuss, but you do accept it's not cost-free to the economy to take no action,
of course, yeah,
on global warming. So, I mean, in terms of the UK economy.
It's a complex system of trade-offs. There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever, yes.
Siobhan?
Well, I'm grateful to Steve for raising the issue of how policy affects poorer people, because what we know is that everything costs more if you're poorer. How you get your gas electricity through prepayment meters, how you pay for your phone by pay-as-you-go rather than contract. But clearly, we need to do something about our homes because they produce 14% of the emissions that we need to cut. So we have to find a way of helping those poorest in order to do the necessary works to their home. Now, a lot of those people won't own their own home. They'll be private tenants, and private landlords have the least well-insulated properties in the country. We have social housing tenants. But the point is that Steve has raised one issue. The other issue is how do you help those people to do the works that need to be done? And we know that doing things about climate change presents a real economic possibility of having greater skills, more jobs that actually pay well, as well as developing a form of trade and manufacture that could put Britain at the front of the queue. So this could be all win, but Steve is absolutely right. It's complicated and the burden should not fall on the poorest.
But it's necessary, says Siobhan. So she obviously is prepared for her constituents to bear some of the costs that you've been talking about if they get help, if they're the poorest. Do you accept that?
But there's about 4 different conversations here. Why do we need to do something? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? What if we do? What if we don't?
Right. Well, on the why we need to do something, I thought you said that was settled.
Yeah, it is settled. But what I'm afraid in this conversation, one of the things I've found is, as you just did, people keep pivoting back, but to we must do something. Yes, I accept we must do something. I mean, you know, the idea that the lives of billions of people should hinge upon the supplies of a finite resource that's fossil fuels would be madness. We should go to net zero for all kinds of reasons, including climate change. And it's a good idea to do it, and we should do it well. So I'm really asking the questions about how. And I would say to anybody who's questioning whether carbon dioxide's a greenhouse gas or whether our emissions of it have made a difference, they're wasting everybody's time having that conversation.
Is it viable, Mark? Is it politically? Have the politicians been honest with people about what the cost might be to individuals and to households?
Well, you put your finger on it. Honesty is the key question about this. It does concern me that, frankly, I think people hear an awful lot of discussion about the importance of net zero, quite a lot less, as Steve says, discussion about how, and almost no discussion about the actual cost, the financial and economic implications. Even, say, the government's own estimates, which various people would say are optimistic over recent years, put the cost by 2050 in the tens of billions of pounds per year. I think a lot of people are unaware of that, and unfortunately, it helps to fuel, if you pardon the pun, it helps to fuel demands that you hear from, say, Extinction Rebellion, who say actually we should go to net zero in 4 years' time. And then you end up with an awful lot of hot air, pardon another pun, being expended on that demand. When actually, if you look at the numbers, you start to realise simply how unreasonable, how unrealistic stuff like that is.
Christina?
Yeah, I think you can find there's probably a lot of agreement here, which is we do have to move to net zero, but we do have to protect those who are least able to afford that move. And there has to be that. What I don't want to see is this being seen as just individual responsibilities. We all have an individual responsibility, we know that, but it's not just an individual responsibility. It's too big for that. There needs to be a proper government strategy for this, which I think they have promised to produce, but it's been delayed again. And it would be good to see what the plan actually is, because I'm sure there is a commitment to move towards this, but we actually have to do it in a sensible way, and you do have to protect those who are least able to afford it, because fuel poverty already exists. I think there's something like 2 million people deemed to be in fuel poverty, and the worst homes in the country actually spend double what they should in having to stay warm. Those who are in the worst homes have to spend double what everyone else does just to stay warm in the winter. So that disproportionate impact already exists, as in if you're in low income, you're going to be in one of the worst kinds of homes. You're going to be in a home that's probably not well insulated, it's drafty, etc. So that has to be a key factor in it.
Yeah, okay.
In Unison, we've been supporting the Just Transition campaign, which is about saying, let's move towards net zero, but actually take the energy companies with us and the staff who work in them and use them to be the ones who go out and work with the public, convince the public, train them to be able to explain to people what they can do. But you need a proper system of government support, and that will have to include loans and grants.
Well, let me put that to Stephen. What is your plan then to get to net zero?
Well, if I may first, the point about... we were talking about the rich and the poor earlier, but we're putting 11 billion a year into renewables through our energy bills at the moment, through consumers paying. Siobhan was talking earlier about poorer people paying more for everything, which would include energy, of course. That translates into subsidies of £300 to £400 million a year for a wind farm, rising to up to £500 million for, I think it's Hornsea 1. These are enormous amounts of subsidy. It's no surprise that Siobhan and I on the Treasury Select Committee have had people giving evidence to us who are all in favour of this system. Of course they are. So the GWPF has published a proposal to go forward, and it involves using small modular nuclear reactors and also closed cycle, so-called Allen cycle, which is a closed cycle that uses gas, but it also captures the carbon dioxide. So there are ideas out there using existing technology which could get us to net zero. But what we can't do is keep kidding ourselves, for example, about the cost of solar, when a recent report in the Harvard Business Review is an impeccably right-on publication as you could find, which shows that when you take the costs of recycling solar, then the costs of producing solar electricity go up 4 times. You know, we've got to get very, very real about the true costs, life cycle of the technologies we're deploying.
Are we kidding ourselves?
Well, I think the government's kidding itself. Its Green Homes deal absolutely collapsed with £1 billion of it unspent because it was a totally unworkable solution marketed to homeowners that didn't want it. So where is the £1 billion? Because again, if that £1 billion is going for free, along with the 200 million from the Royal Yacht, I've got people who need houses to live in.
Right. I mean, you were elected on a manifesto that promised the UK will lead the global fight against climate change by delivering on a world-leading target of net zero by 2050. Should the government reconsider that pledge?
So what I'm asking is questions about how we're going to get there, which are in fact compatible with the manifesto. But in Wickham, at the last general election, the public were all over the green issues. They were very high prominence, and I promised to look into this issue, and I've come to the conclusion that this is the territory that I should be on. But I'm not challenging the targets. I'm not challenging the science. I'm asking how are we going to do it. And actually, I think people should be, as has happened on this programme, uniting around the idea that we need to use tactics which will work.
Right. You did also suggest, though, I think I'm right in saying, that you thought there could be sort of riots worse than the poll tax if there wasn't more honesty on this. Did you really mean that? I really mean that, yes, because we've had the chief executive, I think it was Vauxhall, say that only upper middle class people will be able to afford cars. Well, I then see a tension that young people in my constituency are at once learning to drive and also demanding green measures. I think they're going to be very disappointed when they discover they can't own a car, can't go on holiday, will have expensive heating that comes up to a lower temperature, their electricity isn't reliable and, by the way, might actually be turned down in order to support somebody else's electric car charging next door. All right. You know, this is capable of creating enormous tensions in society at a time when every political party agrees it's the right policy and there's no choice at the ballot box. We've been down this road before with Brexit, and that's why I'm warning that we'll have a terrible political crisis if we don't sort it out. I'm just going to bring you this news that has come to us, which is that Jeffrey Donaldson has been named the leader-designate of the Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party. You will know, if you've been watching this programme over the last week, that there has been a certain amount of turmoil in Northern Ireland politically in terms of the DUP, and Edwin Poots had already said that he was going to quit. I think he'd only been leader for about 21 days or so. So that's the news, that Jeffrey Donaldson, not surprisingly, is now the leader, or certainly the leader-designate of the DUP. We're going to talk about the Windrush Compensation Scheme. It's a story that we've been following very closely on this programme. Now, the scheme has always been controversial. Critics say it takes too long to process payments and doesn't pay out enough money. And now the Labour Party is calling for it to be taken away from the Home Office and given to an independent body. This is the headline in The Guardian. Independent body should run Windrush Compensation Scheme. Let's welcome Jackie McKenzie, lawyer representing around 200 Windrush victims. Welcome to you. Do you agree, Jackie, that the Home Office shouldn't be the ones running this compensation scheme?
Well, that was my position at the outset. I mean, we said, you know, it is the Home Office that's caused the problems that people are in a sense, as we describe in law, they're the tortfeasor. So we didn't understand. And when I made written submissions during the consultation era, I said that the Home Office weren't suitable to manage this. However, we are where we are. And my worry, I certainly sympathise and understand the concerns that people have who are saying that it should be taken away from them. But we're 3 years on from the scandal coming into the public domain. And I'm very worried that to take it away from them now is going to cause further delays. So I'd rather see they sort out the issues. There's all sorts of issues around employment, pensions. There doesn't appear to me to be critical independent oversight. And I think, and there is obviously the big issue about delay and the low numbers of people who are coming forward, which I think is because the engagement policy isn't appropriate. If they can sort those things out, then we'd be happy. But at the moment, it's extremely problematic. But I don't think that moving it at this stage is really the solution.
All right, Jackie, we'll come back to you in a moment. Just listening to that, Siobhan, she doesn't agree with Labour's position on this.
I think you have to listen to Jackie. She's dealing with a lot of the cases. She's dealing with one of my own constituents at the moment. But there's approximately 11,500 people who are affected and may be entitled to compensation, and only 687 granted compensation. 21 people have died before getting it. You know, this was a huge tragedy on people who only came here to this country to work hard, pay their taxes and their national insurance, and have been treated absolutely appallingly. While it's really important who should do it, my main concern is that those great people should actually get the compensation they deserve
so
for having their lives upended.
Right, so you don't necessarily back your party's idea of moving it away from the Home Office to an independent body?
I think it's a pragmatic one. If the Home Office simply can't do it, give it to somebody else. It's up to the Home Office to try and prove it can, and to date, that hasn't happened.
Right, Jackie, the Home Office says things have improved since Priti Patel announced reforms to the scheme in December. Is that the experience of the victims you represented?
It has improved in terms of some of the tariffs. There's been the introduction of preliminary payments, which has helped a lot of people. It's something we asked for, and that's happened, and so I'm grateful for that. My major concerns are so few people are actually coming forward. And I think when you've still got a language coming out of the Home Office about, you know, people being deported and people in the Channel and, you know, the problems that EU citizens are facing accessing the EU settled status scheme, I think it's frightening a lot of those in the Windrush generation who should come forward. They're still very frightened that the hostile environment's alive. Oh. And so the Home Office needs to avail or to really assure people that this isn't the case. They also need to put more resources into the community to engage with those people who are too scared to come forward. They also need to sort out the glitches in the system around the issues that I spoke of earlier, pensions and so forth, and do the job. Now, if they can't do the job, or if they won't do the job within a very short time frame to come, then I think I do have to back the idea that it goes from them. But I'm very worried that that's going to cause a delay, and the delay is causing hardship.
Right. Well, Steve, do you think they've had enough time, really, the Home Office, to deal with these issues that are obviously continuing? Shouldn't it just be taken away from them, as Labour suggest, and go to an independent body? That might encourage people to come forward.
Well, that's tempting to suggest that, but one of the big problems with all government schemes is the complexity of implementation and the actual business of delivery, which we've talked a little bit about.
And its reputation.
And its reputation. As I said in the Commons in my speech on the Windrush scheme, we need to recover our reputation for just administration. This whole episode's been utterly shaming. I represent a community 5% black, mostly from or connected to St Vincent and the Grenadines. We've had a very low number of cases, so I can't say much about them. But the experience in Wickham has been that we bent over backwards to reach members of the community. We believe we have done. But the experience of the administration of the scheme in a very low number of cases is that a large sum of money was paid very quickly. But, you know, the government has taken steps. So, for example, look at a December 2020 fact sheet on the scheme, raised the minimum award from £250 to £10,000, raised the maximum award from £10,000 to £100,000, raising the impact of life payments at every level. So I think government's intent is right, but the charges which Jackie makes are very serious, and of course the Home Secretary must act to make sure that the officials she have do deliver.
Right. Christina, are you convinced by that? We'll come back to Jackie in a moment, but the government's intent is the right one, says Steve, despite the initial problems.
I would like to think that's true. I have to say I am a bit sceptical about it. I mean, I think they've kind of been forced into taking some action on this. We submitted evidence to the Select Committee last December calling for this scheme to be removed from the Home Office and given to an independent body. I completely, accept Jackie's experience of this is much closer to it than mine is. But we have been, as a trade union, Unison has been supporting our members who've been severely affected by this, and we do have numbers of people who have been quite badly affected. And it's been about people's lives have been put on hold. And what we're hearing from our members is that, and from their families, is that they're having to jump through so many hoops to try and get something from this scheme. And there is that, I think Jackie said it as well, there's that feeling of mistrust, I think. That's what we're hearing back. Mistrust of the Home Office and their intent behind this. People who've already had a negative experience, feeling they don't really want to put themselves in the firing line again. So we have to win back the confidence and trust of people who've been severely affected by this to get them to get access to the scheme.
Mark, you were nodding away there.
Yeah, I think there's it's encouraging to hear that some aspects of this are improving. I think Jackie is absolutely right when she mentioned earlier about making sure there's some kind of proper independent oversight and scrutiny, which is evidently overdue and necessary. But what troubles me is that this isn't the first time, and I fear that it won't be the last time, that inside the Home Office's bureaucracy, there seems you sometimes hear people say, is it incompetence or is it being obstructive? And sometimes there's a kind of feeling that, to some degree, an element of the incompetence is viewed as serving the purpose of being obstructive. I've got personal experience of helping somebody, a different case this, but somebody to whom the Home Office was saying that they were not a UK citizen. And I'm not an immigration lawyer, but I was able to go, I went back to the legislation, I read it, and I had to argue with them over the course of months until they eventually conceded the person in question was legally a UK citizen. And the default attitude there seemed to be, oh, well, it's somebody else's job to kind of force us to pay attention in enough detail. And obviously in the Windrush scandal, that was taken to even more obscene and unjust heights. So it does concern me that these are signs of a bureaucracy which is not functioning correctly.
Jackie, any reaction to what you've heard?
Yes, no, I think the default position is always one with all sorts of issues around immigration, of mistrust. And so I think, that's why we're seeing the low take-up of numbers. But the biggest issue here is even of the people who've applied, remember, the Home Office thought that 50,000 people would avail themselves of status documents. I think about 13,000 have. Of those, almost everybody will have had some impact on their life. Yet only 600 and odd people have had any compensation. So there is an issue within the Home Office about delay. I'm seeing letters coming out saying to people, we don't yet know if you've got a claim, when it's very clear that there is one. There are problems also with the design of the scheme around employment and pensions. So I don't know that just lifting that up and putting it somewhere else is going to work if it goes with those same features that are problematic. I really do think the scheme needs a slight overhaul. The Home Office needs to be made to do its job.
All right, Jackie, stay with us again for the next bit. Steve, you're chairing the advisory board for a new group, the Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. What do you hope to achieve? We
need to define a new language which is positively anti-racist for Conservatives. You invited me on this programme last time I was on, I think, to talk about white privilege, which I did. You're trying to use a plain language interpretation of the term. And what an enormous pushback I had. Really caused tremendous problems with people on the Conservative side of the argument. But what I think too many people haven't realised is it's not enough simply to say we're not racist. We've got to define a new language which is inclusive, which doesn't cancel people, which reaches out and recognises that there is racism in the country, and we've got to deal with it. So as Conservatives, that's what we're doing. We're inviting people today to join us and sign our pledge, which they can find online and through my social media, and we are going to set out a new and optimistic and hopeful language of inclusion.
Right, well, is that necessary, Jackie? You heard that big promotion there for the left and right of politics to in some way own this issue.
Well, I don't think, it's a humanitarian issue. I don't think it's really left or right. Nobody should be racist. But what we've got in this country are institutions that are racist. The system is racist in many ways. We've seen it in education. It's particularly, today's Windrush Day. We're talking about the Windrush generation. Just recently, we were discussing the issues that came out of the Small Axe series and Subnormal, about how Caribbean and African children were treated in the educational system. We're seeing it with the disparities around COVID indexes, that there are real problems with stop and search, employment, the employment tribunals. There are real problems at an institutional level that needs to, and so, the Conservatives are in government, and I think they need to use legislation, policy and rules to make sure that the system changes. In terms of who owns the debate, I think that's quite ridiculous, really, because what we are all human beings, and we shouldn't be saying that this is an ideological thing.
No, okay.
We should all be striving to be anti-racist. I quite think the fact that the Conservatives are having to set up a group to discuss not being racist is problematic, because it's almost as though it's saying, well, we are racist.
Well, Steve,
we were warned that people would say that, but I have to say that I think it is necessary for us to demonstrate in the context of the national debate that we are willing to stand up and say we are going to be positively anti-racist and move this debate forward. And we're going to do it as Conservatives. Now, this, of course, was not set up by me. It was set up by Albie Hammond-Kona and Siobhan Aarons. I'm very proud of them. I'm very proud to work with them. And we are going to do this because it's in the public interest that we should do it. It's not about owning the debate. And indeed, on our website, it does say this isn't about left and right. This is about right and wrong.
But it is about party politics, clearly. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called a Conservative group, would it?
Well, Yes, it is true that we are appealing to Conservatives, but we recognise that we need to make sure that our society has a home for everybody in each party.
All right. Jackie, we've only got 30 seconds left, but you take it away.
Conservatives are in government. They need to get the institutions to fix themselves up, because too many people are really suffering from racism and discrimination, even on this Windrush Day. It's a good day to discuss this.
Right. Well, Steve, do you accept institutions' racism?
I certainly accept it's Windrush Day and we should celebrate the Windrush generation. I'm very proud to do just that.
That's all we've got time for from all of us. Bye-bye.